És l'últim Cafè Europa de la temporada vol dir del 2022, i avui dedicarem aquest Cafè Europa a parlar de la situació econòmica o de les previsions econòmiques pel 23. Estan passant moltes coses, vam sortir molt fletxats de la pandèmia, hem tingut un creixement sostingut durant l'últim any, però les previsions s'estan enfosquint. I justament d'això és del que parlarem avui, que hem d'esperar l'any 23. Avui el pes de la sessió recaurà sobre l'Albert. L'Albert donarà ara la benvinguda en nom d'Horitzó Europa, presentarà la temàtica, presentarà els ponents i després moderarà també el diàleg. Per tant, passo la paraula directament a l'Albert i moltes gràcies a tothom per ser aquí.
Bon dia a tothom. Gràcies per acompanyar-nos en aquest nou Cafè Europa. I com bé deia el Pau, parlarem de previsions econòmiques de cara a l'any 23 i 24. Tot just fa 2 setmanes, l'11 de novembre, la Comissió va presentar el que són les previsions econòmiques pels propers 2 anys, que auguren un escenari incert i complicat pel continent. Factors com la guerra de Rússia a Ucraïna, el mercat del gas i els possibles problemes de subministrament, la pujada de la inflació, els tipus d'interès elevats i les febles perspectives de creixement són algunes de les amenaces que planen sobre el futur d'Europa de cara als propers 24 mesos i que poden passar factura tant a l'economia espanyola com a l'economia catalana. Per fer-ho tenim una persona que està molt ben documentada, és en Simon O'Connor, que és el gabinet i assessor en comunicació del Comissari Europeu d'Afers Econòmics y Monetaris, Paolo Gentiloni. Paolo, Simon, muchísimas gracias por aceptar nuestra invitación. Serà una sessió multilingüe. En Simon farà la presentació en anglès, però podeu fer les preguntes en català o castellà sense problemes. I abans de passar-li la paraula us presento una mica el seu perfil. En Simon O'Connor, com us deia, és membre del gabinet de Paolo Gentiloni des del desembre de l'any 2019. De fet, gestiona les relacions del comissari amb els mitjans internacionals i l'aconsella amb l'estratègia de comunicació i amb la participació en diversos fòrums internacionals, com pot ser el Fons Monetari Internacional, el G7 o el G20. De fet, va estar fa pocs dies a la reunió del G20 acompanyant el comissari. I també l'assessora amb la relació amb diversos estats membres i socis internacionals de la Unió. Prèviament, entre els anys 2014 i 2019, va tenir una responsabilitat similar amb el gabinet de Pierre Moscovici, d'aleshores comissari d'Afers Econòmics i Financers durant la Comissió Juncker. Abans, entre els anys 12 i 14, va treballar en el Servei de Portaveus de la Comissió Europea com a portaveu responsable d'Afers Econòmics i Monetaris i com a portaveu també del president Barroso en temes econòmics durant els anys 11 i 12. Prèviament, en Simon ha estat editor d'una revista sobre afers europeus que s'edita a Brussel·les i només perquè coneixeu una miqueta el perfil més personal, en Simon O'Connor és nascut a l'illa de Jersey, a les Illes. Té uns orígens familiars irlandesos o irlando-italians i ha estudiat a Anglaterra, a França i a Itàlia abans de desplaçar-se a Brussel·les l'any 1999. Está casado y tiene 3 fills. Simon, pues muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos hoy. Te paso la palabra. Contamos con unos 20 minutos para tu presentación y después pasé la palabra a Jordi Augusto, que va a complementar tu presentación desde un punto de vista más local y abriremos el Q&A con toda la audiencia, que de hecho ya os invitamos a todos a escribir vuestras preguntas a través del chat. Y después, pues, esperamos tener un debate interesante entre todos. Simon, cuando quieras, y de nuevo gracias por aceptar de participar en esta charla.
Gracias, Albert. Gracias, Pau. Bon dia. Buenos días to everyone. I'll do my presentation in English, if that's okay, because I have everything prepared in English, but we can indeed have the conversation in Spanish and in English afterwards. So I'm going to run through the main messages from our autumn 2022 economic forecast, which Commissioner Gentiloni presented 2 weeks ago today. there are 5 key messages I will ask you to take home. First of all, the EU economy is at a turning point. So after a surprisingly strong first half of the year 2022 in terms of GDP growth, the EU economy lost momentum in the third quarter, so over the summer basically, and recent survey data, so confidence indicators among businesses and consumers point to a contraction in the economy this winter. So the fourth quarter of this year and the first quarter of next year, we expect a contraction in GDP. And on an annual basis, we project very subdued growth in 2023, and a moderate recovery in 2024. Second, inflation has continued to rise faster than expected, but we believe that the peak in inflation is near. It will most likely happen at the end of around the end of this year. Of course, we have been adjusting our inflation projections with every successive forecast, as have all other forecasters. So there remains a lot of uncertainty, of course, around this. Third, the EU labour market remains really the bright spot of the economic picture, and we expect it to continue to show resilience. The increase in unemployment next year is projected to be very moderate, and we expect unemployment to fall again in 2024. Fourth, we project government deficits to remain above 3% in the majority of countries, but to decline. And we project debt ratios to continue declining in the EU. And fifth, as I mentioned, uncertainty around this forecast remains exceptionally high. Now, we've been saying this for the last couple of years because we've been in situations where we've been hit by what economists call black swan events. So, extremely unusual, very hard, possible to predict events. First of all, the pandemic, of course, and then the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That makes the whole process of forecasting, of course, very complicated and challenging. And so we're in that situation, and we also face a number of risks which are predominantly to the downside. I will go through those in a moment. Just to explain, in such a situation, we have to base our forecasts on a number of assumptions, so technical assumptions which we build our forecasts on. So these aren't forecasts in themselves, but these are just things that we assume will happen in order to be able to build the projections. So we assume that geopolitical tensions will neither normalize nor escalate, so will remain broadly stable over the course of the forecast horizon. So that's 2023, 2024. We assume that all sanctions that have been adopted so far against Russia will remain in place. We assume, in terms of energy, we assume that a continuation of demand reduction and supply diversification will ensure that the EU economy avoids major gas shortages over the next 2 years. And we assume that the process of monetary policy tightening will continue without inducing disorderly adjustments in financial markets. Can everyone hear me okay? Is it all clear? Okay, great. So on the GDP, we expect GDP in 2022 to have grown by 3.3% in the EU as a whole. That's so that's a very strong performance. It's thanks to partly to a significant carryover from 2021. In the second half of 21, growth was very strong, and that has an impact on the figures for 22. Also, the first half of this year was very strong, as I said, surprisingly strong. in spite of the Ukraine situation that was already, of course, occurring as of February. The southern member states in particular have had a very good tourist season this summer. For 23 as a whole, we project growth to drop very significantly to just around 0.3% for the EU, for both the EU and the Eurozone as a whole. So that's well below what we had been forecasting over the summer. So our last forecast was in July, just 4 months ago, and at that time we were expecting growth next year of around 1.5%. So that's dropped obviously very markedly. And then for 24, we project growth to regain some traction and to reach around 1.5% in the euro area, 1.6% in the EU. Regarding the largest EU economies, there's a marked difference between the situation in Germany, where the soaring energy costs are having a big impact on consumers, but also on industry confidence and hitting industrial output. In Germany, we expect growth this year of 1.6, dropping to a recession next year. So Germany will be the only major EU economy that we project to be in recession in 2023, with a decline of 0.6, and then a recovery to around 1.4 in 2024. In France, the economy the picture is slightly better. Growth of 2.6% this year, 0.4% in 23. So very slightly above what we project for the EU as a whole, and 1.5% in 2024. In Italy, growth of 3.8 in 22, 0.3 in 23, and 1.1% in 2024. And then in Spain, maybe a little bit more detail for you on Spain. We forecast, again, a deceleration of growth next year. The pressures stemming from the high energy prices are expected to partially ease from around the middle of 23, enabling a gradual pickup in economic activity on the back of a moderate revival in private consumption and a further normalization of tourism. The expansion of the economy is expected to be more robust in 2024 on the back of invigorated domestic and external demand. And the real GDP growth for this year is projected at 4.5%, before easing to 1% in 23 and edging up to 2% in 24. So of the larger Eurozone economies, the Spanish one is the one that we project to be doing best this year and next year. Now, of course, Italy and Spain were the two large economies that had the biggest hit in 2020. So you have to also factor this in. They had a very strong recovery last year, and that's still feeding through with the recovery in tourism and with tourism in particular and contact services. This is helping to fuel growth in the Southern European economies in general. Now, a few words on energy prices and inflation. So, as you all know, wholesale prices of gas and electricity in the EU soared during the summer, have come down significantly in the last couple of months. There's some increase in the very recent past, the last couple of weeks, as demand has increased as the winter heating season starts. But overall, down a lot compared to the peaks that we saw over the summer. This reflects also the successful filling of storage tanks. The target of 90% storage that we set at the EU level has been exceeded ahead of time, and also benefiting from the relatively mild temperatures that in Northern Europe in particular we've seen over the last few weeks, although that's come to an end now and it's quite chilly here. Futures prices also for 23 and 24 have declined similarly. So current gas storage, as I said, is significant to allow our economies to get through this winter without too much difficulty. But looking ahead to the winter of 23-24, the near absence of Russian gas and the difficulty that we would expect in further expanding LNG imports, and also considering infrastructure bottlenecks, will make it much more challenging to refill the storage capacity, the gas storage capacity ahead of next winter. So that's going to be a more difficult moment. And as you know, then electricity prices remain in Europe in general. It's a different situation slightly in the Iberian Peninsula, but it remain very highly correlated with gas. So inflation overall, we expect to keep increasing until around the end of the year. So of course, we're nearly there now. So we expect the peak this winter and then a gradual decline to start next year. We expect headline inflation. So we expect headline inflation to project at 9.3% in the EU and 8.5% in the Eurozone, gradually decelerating in 23 to 7% in the EU and 6.1% in the Eurozone. And only in 24, we would expect a more marked decline to 3% in the EU and 2.6% in the Eurozone. So still, of course, above the European Central Bank's target of 2%. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty also around the inflation forecast, as I mentioned, because of course the situation in around energy supplies, all the uncertainty about what will happen with the war in Ukraine. Also, the uncertainty, which I'll say a little bit more about in a moment, about the extension of the fiscal support measures and whether these will contradict what the ECB is doing in terms of monetary policy by potentially fueling demand, needs to be factored in as a source of uncertainty. And just to mention then also that within the EU there's very, very wide divergence in terms of inflation. So this year, for example, inflation ranged from 5.8% in France, so this is the annual average, to 19% in Estonia. And next year, the range is projected to be only slightly smaller, with the lowest we project in Denmark at 3.7% and 15.7% in Hungary. As regards to the labour market, as I said, this is the bright spot. The EU economy is really bolstered by the strongest labour market in decades. And actually, we have the lowest unemployment rates and the highest employment rates that we have seen since the launch of the euro. And our analysis suggests that even as demand, as demand weakens and even contracts, we will see the number of vacancies and labour shortages reducing before unemployment starts to increase. And we project only a small increase in unemployment next year, from 6.2% in 22 to 6.5%, before falling again in 24 to around 6.4. So, unemployment obviously compared to the levels that we had seen in recent years and during the financial crisis, much more limited, which is of course very good news. Wage growth is increased to above average rates in 22 and is expected to remain strong, but is only expected to partially compensate for the loss of purchasing power that we're seeing due to the very high inflation. In other words, we don't yet see significant feedback loops between wages and inflation. Of course, this is something that policymakers need to keep a very close eye on. In terms of public finances, the strong growth this year has helped to drive a further reduction in deficits in 22, in spite of the new measures to mitigate the impact of energy prices on households and on firms. So the fiscal deficit in the EU this year, so from 4.6% last year, it's projected to fall to 3.4% this year. but to rise slightly to 3.6% in 23, and then to drop again slightly to do I have the figure here, to 3.2% in 2024. Now, there's quite a lot of uncertainty around. I'm sorry if I keep talking about uncertainty, but so the Commission makes its projections, makes its forecasts based on what we call a no policy change assumption. So we only take into account policy measures, fiscal measures, and spending measures that have been credibly announced already by governments with a sufficient amount of detail. So in terms of the fiscal support measures to combat the energy crisis, many countries have announced measures, extending the measures from this year into next year, but maybe only until the first quarter of next year. It's not that it varies from country to country, but in many cases, they're only announced for a few months next year. But obviously with the expectation that energy prices will remain high and there will need to be further support provided to firms and business and to the households, there's a high risk that these measures will be extended, and as such, there's a high risk that our deficit projections will have to be revised up over the course of the coming quarters for 2023. Let me skip through. Yeah, then in terms of public debt ratios are benefiting from inflation. The high inflation that we've seen is helping to reduce the public debt to GDP ratios. So for the EU as a whole, we project debt to GDP to decline from 89.5% of GDP in 21 to by about 5 points to 84.1% in 2024. In terms of the risks that I mentioned, just to go into a little bit more detail, obviously the potential for further economic disruptions is first of all due to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is far from exhausted. The largest threat comes from adverse developments on the gas market and the risk of shortages, especially, as I mentioned, next winter. Now, in this situation of uncertainty, we have, in addition to our baseline forecast, we have presented a scenario of a more adverse outcome. So we project that in case of complete stop of gas flows from Russia, compounded by insufficient savings in gas consumption, and if we have 2 cold winters this year and next year, we calculate that the GDP, rather than growing by 0.3% next year, could shrink by 0.9%. In 2024, we projected growth, rather than recovering to around 1.5%, would be only around 0.5%, and inflation would be around 2% higher, 2 percentage points higher in 2024 compared to our baseline. Now, if member states are able to prepare effectively for such an outcome, the impact could be mitigated to some extent, but we would still be looking at a worse outcome than what we project in our baseline. Other risks involve, of course, the monetary policy tightening that we're seeing in Europe, but also in the US and around the world. That of course entails risks to in terms of financial vulnerabilities in the corporate sector, and there's of course always the possibility that renewed stress in financial markets could emerge. And if the monetary policy tightening in the US, in particular, proceeds more quickly than is expected, And if that leads to a sharp strengthening of the dollar, as we saw in recent months, although it's eased slightly in the last few weeks, that of course increases the pressure on vulnerable emerging economies and developing economies, which have a large part of their debt denominated in dollars. So at the global level, this is another risk. So to wrap up, we're obviously approaching the end of a year that has been marked by the return of war to but in spite of this major shock, growth in the first part of the year was markedly stronger than analysts overall expected and the consensus expected, even into the third quarter. But now our economies, in spite of that resilience, of course, are starting to inevitably feel the impact of the energy and inflation situation. And so we have some difficult months ahead, a couple of difficult quarters certainly ahead of us. But there is it's within the grasp of policymakers, both at the EU level and at the national level, to mitigate this impact. We saw during the pandemic that strong policy decisions united a united approach and a determined approach to take decisions to support the economy through things like the SURE mechanism, the SURE program, which supported short-term work schemes across the EU. So things like the ERTES in Spain had a significant played a significant part in avoiding a worse unemployment outcome. As I mentioned, of course, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, Next Generation EU, is a major tool and a very different tool to what we were able to put together during the financial crisis. And all of these things, have had a significant impact in supporting confidence and in helping to drive a sharp recovery in 21, which benefited this year. So if we're able to continue to take similar decisions, similarly united, maintain a united front, which will be a major challenge in the coming months for the EU, we all know that. But if we're able to do that, we see a strong possibility that we can emerge from this challenging moment, mitigating the negative impact. I'll wrap up there and hand over back to Albert.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you for this last positive note, which let us be a little bit more optimistic with the difficult months and quarters that we have ahead. And now we shift to Jordi Angusto. Jordi és economista, ha estat assessor del Departament de la Vicepresidència i d'Economia i Hisenda de la Generalitat de Catalunya entre els anys 2018 i 2020. A més, ha estat vicepresident de la Comissió d'Innovació del Col·legi d'Economistes. És especialista en polítiques públiques. La seva carrera professional s'ha centrat a la ciutat de Barcelona i a la promoció econòmica d'arrel científica i tecnològica. A més, ha estat professor de la UAB i assessor econòmic al Parlament Europeu entre els anys 2014 i 2016. Per tant, Jordi, quan vulguis, et passo la paraula. Estàs en mute, hauries d'activar el micro.
¿Ahora?
Sí, fantástico.
Buenos días, Simon. Gracias por esta amplia visión panorámica sobre lo que desde la Unión Europea, desde la Comisión Europea, imagináis que puede ser el próximo futuro. Yo entiendo que una de vuestras misiones es el forward guidance y que por lo tanto nos estáis explicando aquellos mensajes que conviene explicar. Y por lo tanto no nos explicáis aquellos que puedan en fin, generar desconfianza y por lo tanto agravar la situación. La verdad es que hay algunas... yo tengo algunas preocupaciones más que complementar, como decía Albert. De hecho, yo tendría algunas preguntas más para poder empezar este debate con el resto de personas que han asistido. Por ejemplo, la primera, la verdad es que los economistas estamos bastante perdidos, no tenemos muchas respuestas a cómo es que la economía la actividad económica se va yendo enfriando y en cambio el mercado laboral resiste también. La verdad es que nos cuesta explicarlo. Habría razones locales, en el caso de España, modificaciones del mercado laboral, pero cuando esto es algo que ocurre casi en toda la Unión Europea, cuesta encontrar respuestas. No sabemos si esto es una bomba latente, si es algo que nos vamos a encontrar después. De hecho, en este momento comprobamos casi con admiración que se han subido los tipos de interés. Es una medida controvertida, porque todos sabemos que la inflación que tenemos hoy en día no es una inflación de demanda, sino que era una inflación de oferta, y que por lo tanto lo que puede hacer una política monetaria es crear recesión, pero no reducir la inflación. Con lo cual el riesgo de que voluntariamente entráramos en un periodo de estanflación, es decir, de bajo actividad económica y alta inflación, serían altos. Parece ser que de momento no se está dando o no se está dando en el mercado laboral, que sería seguramente el más importante. No sabemos, y ahí la pregunta es si puede haber rebotes en el futuro. Más cosas. Es factible, ya sé que esto es una pregunta casi filosófica, pero es factible un mercado único con este rango de diferenciales de inflación que tenemos. Esos diferenciales de inflación que van a suponer en términos de macrodesequilibrios, es decir, vamos a ver de nuevo grandes déficits comerciales en países que hayan perdido competitividad y superávits en los contrarios, y cómo vamos a resolver eso. Y después creo que hoy, si no me equivoco, hay una reunión de los ministros de Comercio y cómo responder a dos riesgos de competencia desleal. Una, la interna, es decir, la carrera de los diversos países para dar ayudas a su propia industria, y después la competencia con los Estados Unidos, que con la última decisión, el último paquete de medidas para reducir la inflación, pues añade una política comercial altamente restrictiva para terceros, puesto que todo el paquete de ayudas va dirigido a lo que es compra local, compra americana, ¿no? Ahí veo algunos riesgos. Por lo tanto, yo me gustaría, Simon, que en fin, uno, si prevéis algún cisne negro en ese sentido de esta inflación. Dos, que en el caso de tu descripción parece ser que solo lo limitáis al 2023 y a partir del 2024 ya habríamos resuelto los problemas. Una. Dos, si es posible esta Unión Europea con estos diferenciales, es decir, si existe realmente un mercado único cuando vemos estos diferenciales de inflación y qué puede suponer. Y tercero, esta política comercial que podríamos llamar de competencia desleal por parte de Estados Unidos, y que se puede reproducir también internamente entre los Estados miembros con una carrera de ayudas a su propia industria local.
Pues gracias, Jordi, gracias por tus comentarios y tus preguntas. Con esto ya empezamos el Q&A. Simon, si te parece bien, puedes ahora intervenir respondiendo a estas preguntas de Jordi y después damos paso a las preguntas que nos están llegando vía el chat.
Yeah, thanks Jordi, for the remarks. Yeah, clearly you touched on some of the key topics at the moment. I mean, in terms of the labour market, we have an artist there. It's, as I said, I think partly the impact of the use of short-time work schemes, which was much more extensive across the EU than it had been in the past, also supported by EU EU measures like SURE in particular. We're still benefiting, of course, from the positive impact of the rebound from the hit to services and to tourism during the pandemic. This was the first, the first more or less normal summer in terms of tourism, and that had a very strong impact on the positive impact on the labour market in a number of countries. Of course, there will be an impact in the coming months. We project it to remain, because there's still a number of there's still a certain amount of slack to be reabsorbed into the labour market. We expect unemployment to remain relatively low, but of course this is something that we need to keep an eye on. And of course the less rosy side of all of this is the impact on purchasing power of households. So even if unemployment is, the unemployment figures are encouragingly low, the purchasing power of households is of course being affected significantly by the cost of living crisis. In terms of I mentioned the divergence in inflation across the EU. It's very marked. In particular, it's related, of course, to the very different energy, the very different structures in the energy markets and the different levels of exposure of national energy markets in the EU to Russian fossil fuel imports, and to the different structures in gas and electricity markets. It's of course an issue, and it makes the task of the European Central Bank, of course, much more complicated when there's so much divergence, and of course when inflation is largely fueled by not by an excess of demand, as is the case in the United States, but more because of supply-related issues, and in particular on the energy front. So here you have a very different situation in the US compared to the European Union. Yeah, in terms of the internal market and risks of fragmentation, I mean, this is something that we're highlighting very strongly. The different amounts of fiscal space that the different countries have, how deep the pockets of different national treasuries are, of course, enables different countries to support their households and their firms to very different degrees. And this is the risks entailed in this are something that Commissioner Gentiloni, for example, has highlighted very strongly and called for further European Union efforts to ensure that those risks can be addressed. So it's something that we're very conscious of. In terms of macroeconomic imbalances, we just put out our latest report looking into the progress in development of imbalances and risks of emerging imbalances in different countries. Just a few days ago, we'll be carrying out in-depth reviews into 17 countries, looking at the situation in terms of housing markets, for example, labor markets, public finances, competitiveness developments, and we'll be putting out reports in the spring looking at how these situations are developing and what policy measures would need to be taken to address them. And then in terms of the issue of protectionist measures and the Inflation Reduction Act, in particular in the US, we have welcomed the support to green renewable energy infrastructure in the US quite strongly, and it's really a game changer. In one sense, it's very positive because it's a game changer in terms of the United States really taking groundbreaking policy decisions to support the development of green energy. On the other hand, we do have a lot of concern about the requirements for firms to benefit from these subsidies, from this support for the manufacturing to take place in the US, and we're seeing plenty of evidence already of the negative impact that that's starting to have on investment decisions in the European Union. There are discussions underway, and we have raised these concerns with the US administration. There are discussions underway to see how the provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act could be looked at to mitigate these negative impacts. So it's certainly a major concern, and I think this will be one of the key discussions in terms of the policy response. There are also different ways in which we can respond to this in the EU, and it's an ongoing discussion, but certainly a very concerning issue as regards the impact of this on investment in these key technologies in the European Union.
Gracias, Simon. Lamentamos este intento de hackeo que estamos viviendo en estos momentos. La verdad, la primera vez que vemos algo así, miraremos a ver cómo podemos evitar que pase algo como esto en el futuro. Nos han llegado 3 preguntas por parte de la audiencia. Una te pregunta básicamente sobre cuál es tu valoración sobre el impacto que puede tener el aumento en los tipos de interés de referencia a la hora de luchar contra la inflación. Una segunda nos dice, se ha hablado del impacto sobre la demanda o sobre el PIB, pero ¿qué pasa cuando hablamos de oferta o de la cadena logística? Y por último, te pido una visión un poco más global, las grandes tendencias a nivel de globalización. ¿Qué va a pasar con la globalización? ¿Se pueden producir más relocalizaciones industriales en el futuro? ¿Hay oportunidades en este sentido para Europa? ¿En qué sectores? Cuando quieras.
Yeah, I mean, on inflation, I already touched on this. The situation is has been very different in the United States compared to the EU in terms of what was driving the surge in inflation. In the US, it was very much a surge in demand following the stimulus packages that were passed during the pandemic, and that led to, earlier this year, to the Fed starting to tighten very quite quickly the interest rates over there. Here in Europe, the task facing the ECB has been, of course, much more challenging because on the one hand, there was a need to, it was clear that projections for inflation were moving, way above the ECB's target. On the other hand, the economy was still emerging, from the unprecedented shock of the pandemic, and of course the negative shock to confidence from the war, from Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, and not so much being driven by demand. Now we have seen over the last few months that inflation has been spreading from energy through to other components of the consumption basket, so through to food, but also through to to industrial products, and basically becoming much broader based. Impacted, of course, also by supply chain difficulties, which is the other question, and supply chain delays in deliveries, which started during the pandemic and have been further exacerbated by the impact of the war. So I mean, it's not, fortunately, I have plenty of challenging tasks, and we have plenty of challenging tasks in the Commission, but monetary policy is the remit of the European Central Bank, and so they are, of course, working hard to find the right way forward to effectively address this inflation and get it back on track, you know, at the right pace, without undermining the recovery any more than is necessary anyway to get inflation on track. But I mean, you all see that there's a debate underway in the ECB, and you see public statements pretty much every day from different governors on this topic. So obviously it's not an easy issue. On globalization, one of the most striking elements of what happened in the first months of the pandemic, of course, was in the very beginning there were these terrible shortages of personal protective equipment, ventilators, of all sorts of essential medical equipment, which had been, which Europe had become very reliant on external manufacturers to provide. It took a few months for all of that to be, for those supply chains to be readjusted. So that was kind of the first moment when all of this became a hot issue in terms of policy discussions, in terms of energy supplies, of course, and in terms of all of this, because of all of the supply chain difficulties that we've seen over the last 2 years, the huge delays in receiving all sorts of essential inputs into the industrial supply chains, because we've become too reliant on production in East Asia or in specific countries. This has shot to the top of the policy agenda, and it's one of the topics that's regularly discussed in the G7 and G20 meetings and the IMF meetings. I mean, it's not so easy to find solutions to this. I mean, there's obviously a trade-off between having more secure supply chains that would be, through reshoring of production, say within the European Union, and not creating too much of an increase in costs. Because of course the reason that these supply chains became so diversified, or rather so so globalized, was because of the reduction in costs that entailed. So there's a trade-off between not increasing costs too much, but at the same time increasing security of supply. There are different ideas on the table. There are a lot of initiatives underway, of course, at the European Union level to strengthen the resilience of industrial supply chains within Europe, or maybe within the European neighborhood. A number of incentives, have been made available. One idea that keeps coming up, that, for example, the US and Canada regularly refer to, is the idea of what's called friendshoring. So the idea of shifting production away from countries that are maybe more hostile, or potentially hostile, or at least not aligned to our values and policy choices. So basically, within moving production to the G7 and Western and democratic countries. Of course, there are a number of challenges involved in that, in terms of practical implementation, and we would be quite skeptical about whether that's really feasible or desirable. But yeah, this will certainly remain one of the most difficult topics that we have to grapple with over the coming year or two.
Gràcies, Simon. Jordi, no sé si tens alguna pregunta o reacció a fer.
Sí. Simon, esta semana, si no estoy equivocado, se ha aprobado por fin la modificación de los recursos propios del presupuesto de la Unión Europea. En concreto, 3 figuras, la del el ajuste en frontera del diferencial de carbono, los ETS y sobre los ingresos, beneficios de las grandes multinacionales, aunque eso está poco detallado. Si van a aumentar los ingresos, se prevé nuevos instrumentos de política económica que puedan ser financiados con esos nuevos ingresos.
Well, there's still quite a lot of work to be done, of course, on in terms of the own resources and the minimum taxation of multinationals. The global tax reform is still in the process of being implemented, and we're facing a number of challenges on that front. And the carbon border adjustment mechanism that you mentioned is also still needs to be finalized. The discussions are still underway between with the Parliament and the Council on this. There will be a mid-term review of the EU's multi-annual financial framework taking place next year. So all of these discussions will be, will start to become a little bit more concrete over the coming year, and then this will be more for the next multi-annual financial framework, which will start in 2028. For this year, or rather for this multi-annual financial framework, so 2021 to 27, we had been going through very difficult, very challenging discussions with the member states, and it had not been possible to reach an agreement on this just before the pandemic hit. And then, within 3 months, the situation was completely turned upside down, and we ended up proposing this unprecedented recovery program, the Next Generation EU, which combined with the EU budget overhaul, the multi-annual EU financial framework. There was an overall agreement leading to a very innovative fund in terms of both financing and the way that that this money could be used, both to finance the recovery, but in particular to support and incentivize reforms and investments aligned with the EU's overall policy priorities. In terms of other, whether this tool could be replicated in the future, or this is clearly a one-off tool, but if it works, could it be an inspiration for something similar in the future, maybe to help Europe to address the massive investment needs that we have in terms of green technologies, digital technologies, resilience of supply chains, as we already discussed. That's certainly a possibility, and I would expect that to be very prominent in the discussions over the coming years, and starting next year on the multi-annual financial framework.
Muchas gracias, Simon. Estamos llegando a las 10. Como he dicho, nuestra intención es acabar a las 10 en punto. Por lo tanto, Simon, te agradezco muchísimo tu intervención y paso la palabra a Pau para que haga el cierre de esta sesión. Pau.
Muy bien. Muchísimas gracias, Albert. Muchísimas gracias, Simon, por tu intervención. Gràcies, Jordi, per fer de contraponent i inaugurar el torn de preguntes. Gràcies a tots per assistir a aquesta sessió sobre les previsions econòmiques del 23. I ens tornem a veure el dia 27 de gener. Com us deia al principi, és l'últim Cafè Europa de l'any. Ens veiem el 27 de gener amb una nova proposta de Cafè Europa. Fins aleshores, bon Nadal i bon any nou.
Bon Nadal.
Bon Nadal.
Yes, bon Nadal.
Ciao.
Ciao.